Hello and welcome to this presentation on quantitative research questions. So in this brief presentation, we're going to look at why we need research questions, and then we'll look at a bit more depth at quantitative research questions and what distinguishes them from qualitative ones. We'll look at categories of descriptive, relational and causal questions. We'll look at the model PICO as a resource that you can use to help generate quantitative questions. And we'll also explore a bit about what hypotheses are. So this presentation shows how important research aims and questions are to the process of developing a research project. So the process you can see here in this slide, it starts with a literature review. This enables you to understand what knowledge has been developed in your area of interest. Remember, academic research is about standing on the shoulders of giants. You're building on all that's gone before. So from your review of literature, you identify a gap, a concern that's not been addressed or not been understood within a particular context. And this leads to your research questions. And they can be qualitative, quantitative, or both. And if you're undertaking quantitative research, you may also develop a hypothesis. You need to develop your question, as from your question flows the methods that you will use, and therefore leads to the types of ethical questions that you need to address and the resources that you need to undertake your research. So you can see here that the research question is pivotal in your research design. So a good research question pinpoints your particular interest within a wider field of study. All research starts with a broader topic of interest, but this needs to be defined into a tighter area of focus. So you need to think about what aspect of the wider issue interests you. Is it how it relates to a particular group within a particular setting or geography? Is it about particular policy response or the way the issue has been reported? Thinking through such different angles helps you pinpoint a researchable focus. The research question then leads to the research design, to sampling, who's involved, and then how will you collect and analyse your data. And there are many, many different ways to research an issue. And what's important is that your project is coherent, that it flows from one stage to the next clearly. This starts with the research question. So there are quantitative and qualitative questions. Quantitative research questions try to generate knowledge from a proposition, from an assertion or a starting point that you're looking to evidence. So it's starting with a clear statement that you want to look for evidence for, to underpin, to prove or disprove. On the other hand, qualitative research starts from the ground up. It starts with curiosity on a specific issue, but no predetermined idea about where the question will lead. There are general criteria for both that should be adhered to. The question should be relevant, it should be clear and unambiguous, and nothing woolly. Should be ethical, no harm should be caused by whatever it is that you propose to look at. It should be achievable, and this is really important, that often people want to address issues that are much wider than the resources or time they've got available. So it's really important that you narrow in on something that you can actually do within your given time frame. And they should address a gap in the literature, so they should come from what is known clearly and should feed back into that body of literature. So following your review of literature and identification of a gap, you formulate an aim, and the aim sets out what you hope to achieve, what gap in knowledge you intend to address. While the question focuses on what aspect of this topic you will address, so it's a tighter focus, and it could be qualitative or quantitative. And if you're undertaking quantitative research, you may then go on to form a hypothesis depending on what type of research you're undertaking, and I'll say more about this later in the presentation. So on quantitative research questions more specifically, so quantitative research by definition involves measuring, and this can be undertaken for different purposes. A first question might be, how frequently does A happen? So for example, how many children are accommodated by a particular local authority in a given time? And then you might also ask, what are the most likely causes of this? What's the most likely reasons for children to be accommodated? And you might use criteria for taking children into care to assess which occur most often in a given time frame. So this gives you a lot of descriptive information. You also might ask, what are the effects of taking children into care? You know, there's many, many different effects, but for example, you might be interested in educational outcomes. So this might be about understanding the difference between X and Y. Do children who've been accommodated generally achieve better or worse grades than those who've not? You count the results to see if there is a difference. And you can also think about if there is a relationship. Does the difference in academic results follow a relational pattern? So is it the case that the longer a child is in care, the better or worse the grades? And then you might go on further to think about, does this allow you to start to predict likely outcomes or patterns? So which factors have the greatest influence on the outcomes for children who've been accommodated? So you can see how one issue can create a lot of different angles, a lot of different types of questions, how one type of question leads to another, how you might need some of that descriptive data in order to go on to look in more detail at these sort of relationships between different forms of data. And in quantitative research, these measures are called variables. So in order to generate a reliable measure, you need to know what you're counting. So you can count the variables to understand the frequency and then go on to try to work out how different variables affect each other. And this is about causation. Does the presence of one variable lead to the presence of another? Is there a connection between them, and is it causal? So broadly speaking, these different types of quantitative questions can form to three types. You have descriptive questions. These tell you if a fact is present, how much, how often, in what context. Relational questions that tell you if there's a connection between factors and variables. So in our previous example, school attainment and care experience. And then you have causal questions. These try to work out if one variable causes another, so the presence of one thing leads directly to another. So just to think about some examples of these in this slide here, if you can read the questions and then think about which would you consider to be descriptive, which relational, and which causal. So you can pause the presentation and have a think about which of these questions you think fall into these different categories. So you can see, so the first one is a descriptive question. It tells you what is the life expectancy of a person who is living in the street, so who is street homeless within a particular time frame. And notice it's really important to nail exactly when and where you're looking at. So this gives you information. It doesn't tell you why, it doesn't tell you how, it doesn't tell you what it feels like, but it tells you something that might be worthy of exploration. And the next question is a relational question. It tells you if there is a connection between homelessness and life expectancy. So is something particular happening here? And you might work this out by comparing the average life expectancy of someone who is living in the street with the average life expectancy of someone who has not had such experience over particular period of time. So that would tell you if there is some difference here in experience, and is there a relationship between rooflessness and life expectancy, or the likelihood of one. And the final question is a causal question, because it's thinking about how does one variable influence another. So is there a connection between the duration of homelessness or street homelessness and mortality? So does one change in direct relation to another? And that tells you if there is something more happening here. If there is if you find out that the greater the length of rooflessness, the shorter the life expectancy, then you can start to think about is that causing the shorter life expectancy. More specifically on causality, quantitative researchers generally use experimental approaches to discover causation or to assess causation. So here's an example here. This is a study. The study aim is to explore the effects of a psychotherapeutic treatment for depression in women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. So very clear group of people and clear intervention. And this is looking to understand if there is a causal relationship between the treatment and the symptoms and the mental health of the women in question. So the research question is, what are the effects of a 12-week psychotherapeutic treatment for depression in women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder? And notice here a subsidiary question is around, are there adverse effects, which you would always want to consider. But this question is looking to try to understand a direct relationship between an intervention and a particular set of people, and work out whether this treatment causes improvement. So how do we come up with quantitative research questions? Well, there's many models out there. There's a fair number of different tools that you can think with to help you come up with your questions. PICO is one of the most widely used for quantitative research, because it forces you to think about the different facets that you need to consider within your creation of a question. So first you've got P, population patient problem. So, who is it that's being affected? Does this relate to symptoms, age, gender? You want to sort of, again, narrowing in on the specifics. The intervention. So what is the intervention? What is it that you are introducing into the equation that you want to measure? Comparison. Is the comparison over time, prior to an intervention, after an intervention, or is it with another group who have not received the same treatment, which is often the case in experimental design, where you would use a group who have not had the treatment to assess whether there's a causal relationship or not. And finally, the outcome. What do you want to achieve? What is it that you want to measure exactly? So if we look at our question that we had earlier on there, what are the effects of a 12-week psychotherapy treatment for depression on women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder? I will leave you for a minute just to think about how you would complete this table if you were working with this question. So you can pause the presentation here and have a think about how you would populate the table with this information. So here is one I made earlier. So you can see here the population, women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. The intervention is the treatment programme. The comparison here is before and after intervention. As I said previously, you might be using a group who have not experienced the treatment. That would be very commonly a way that you would approach this type of study. And what's the change? You want to improve the symptoms of depression. That's why you're doing this study. You want to understand if you have come up with a model that will help improve symptoms. So another important aspect of experimental design is the hypotheses, and we'll just think about how this fits in with this particular study. So the hypothesis is the proposition. So in the study, the previous study, the proposition would be that this intervention does improve symptoms of depression. You wouldn't go to the trouble of designing the study if you weren't confident that you had a model that had a good chance of making a difference. So that's what you would be hypothesizing, and that's what you would be testing. So just to delve a bit deeper into how we work with a hypothesis. So as I said, a hypothesis is an assertion that can be tested. So in this example here, from the question that we used earlier, a 12-week psychotherapeutic treatment for depression offered to women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder will alleviate symptoms. So that's our assertion. And it is known as H1, sometimes HA. So that's the assertion that we're working with in this particular intervention. You know, it needs to be something that is testable, a proposition that we can actually put to work in the real world and make sense of whether it actually is the case or not. But what we test is not that assertion, but the inverse of that assertion, or what's called the null hypothesis, or what you can see here is H0. So the null hypothesis is the opposite of the proposal that the researcher is trying to prove. And the null hypothesis is assumed true until proven otherwise. So in this case, the null hypothesis would be a 12-week psychotherapeutic treatment for depression offered to women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder will have no difference on symptoms. And working with the null hypothesis, it means that there's less bias in the system. And it also means that what you're proving is the likelihood of the hypothesis rather than the false impression that it is absolutely true all of the time, which is impossible to prove. So the null hypothesis is what is tested. And if it is disproved by a significant amount, then that provides evidence that says that the hypothesis, the assertion that you've made, is likely to be true. So that's how we work with hypotheses. So in this short presentation, we have looked at how we form research questions. We've looked specifically at quantitative questions and how these relate to variables and measures of variables and relationships between variables. We've discussed how they can be descriptive, relational, or causal. We've looked at PICO as a model that can help you generate research questions, and we've looked briefly at hypothesis, which some research design approaches require within quantitative research. So thank you so much for watching and listening. Here's some references that you might want to follow up that have informed this presentation, and thanks again.